The moment Grace Hawkins said no to Jacob Crawford in front of the entire town of Rattlesnake Bend, Texas, every jaw in the Silver Spur Saloon dropped so fast you could have heard them hit the floorboards over the sound of the piano. It was the spring of 1881, and Rattlesnake Bend sat baking under a relentless West Texas sun, a scrubby little town of perhaps 400 souls perched between the Pecos River and a stretch of mesquite-covered flatland that seemed to go on forever in every direction. The town had a general store, a post office, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a sheriff's office that was perpetually understaffed, and the Silver Spur Saloon, which did considerably more business than any of the others. There was also a small clinic run by old Doc Prout, who was pushing 70 and had a tendency to prescribe whiskey for everything from toothaches to broken bones. Into this dry, dusty, sun-bleached world, Grace Hawkins had arrived 6 months prior, and she had already managed to make herself absolutely indispensable while simultaneously driving half the town absolutely mad. She had come from Austin, where she had spent 3 years working as a schoolteacher before the school board, dominated by men who believed women ought to confine their ambitions to the domestic sphere, had decided they no longer required her services. The truth of it was that Grace had taught her students not only reading and arithmetic, but also critical thinking, and when one of her older students had publicly questioned why the water rights along Barton Creek were distributed so unevenly, the school board had decided Grace Hawkins was a dangerous influence. She had packed everything she owned into 2 leather trunks and a carpet bag, and had taken the stage west, drawn by an advertisement for a teacher in Rattlesnake Bend that had asked only for someone with patience and a willingness to work hard. What the advertisement had not mentioned was that the previous teacher had left town after 2 of the ranching family's sons had run his horse into the next county, nor that the schoolhouse roof leaked in 4 places, nor that half the children in town had never sat in a classroom before in their lives. Grace had walked into the schoolhouse on her first morning, surveyed the chaos, rolled up her sleeves, and gotten to work. Within a month, she had the children reading. Within 2 months, she had patched the roof herself with the help of 3 of the older boys she had bribed with promises of reading adventure stories on Friday afternoons. Within 3 months, even the most skeptical parents in Rattlesnake Bend had admitted, quietly and usually only to their spouses, that the new teacher might be something remarkable. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair. She kept pinned severely at the back of her head during school hours, but which she let fall in long waves on Sunday mornings when she walked to church. She had green eyes the color of creek water in summer, a straight, determined nose, and a mouth that curved into genuine smiles when something truly delighted her, which happened more often than people expected from a woman who carried herself with such composed dignity. She was not beautiful in the soft, conventional way that the men of Rattlesnake Bend were accustomed to admiring, but there was something in the way she held herself, something in the directness of her gaze and the quiet certainty of her movements, that made people look at her twice, and then a third time, trying to understand what it was about her that arrested their attention so completely. Jacob Crawford was the reason most of the cattle in the county were kept organized, profitable, and moving. He was the top hand on the Rafter C Ranch, which belonged to old Tom Calloway, a cattleman who had built his empire in the years following the Civil War, and who now, at 63, was content to let Jacob run the day-to-day operations, while Tom himself devoted his considerable energy to arguing with anyone who would listen about the encroachment of the railroads and the changing face of the open range. Jacob was 29 years old and had been working cattle since he was 15, first in Kansas and then in New Mexico before drifting down to Texas 6 years ago, and taking a job with the Rafter C that he had never had any intention of keeping permanently and had somehow never left. He was tall, with shoulders that had been broadened by years of roping and hauling and wrestling ornery longhorns into submission, and his face was tanned to a deep brown by the relentless Texas sun. He had dark brown eyes that were perceptive in a way that sometimes unnerved people who expected cowboys to be simple, and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges when it grew too long between haircuts. He was handsome in the direct, uncomplicated way of a man who was simply put together well and had never given it much thought. He had a reputation in Rattlesnake Bend, built over 6 years of Saturdays in town, of being easy with a smile and easier with a compliment, the sort of man who tipped his hat to every woman he passed, and who had danced with more than a few of them at the annual harvest celebration. He was well liked, respected by the men he worked with, and considered by most of the eligible women in the county to be an extremely desirable prospect, even if he had never shown the slightest inclination toward settling down. The incident that changed everything happened on a Saturday afternoon in late April, when the cattle drive season was just beginning to stir to life, and Jacob had ridden into town to collect supplies for the ranch and had ended up, as he frequently did, at the Silver Spur for a beer before heading back. He had been sitting at the bar talking with the barkeep, a stout man named Porter who knew everything about everyone in Rattlesnake Bend, and considered it his professional duty to share this information freely, when Grace Hawkins had come into the saloon. She had come in looking for Sheriff Duggan, who used the back room of the Silver Spur as an informal office on Saturdays when his actual office became too stuffy. She was carrying a ledger under one arm and had a pencil tucked behind her ear, and she walked through the saloon with the same composed authority she brought to her classroom, apparently entirely unbothered by the fact that respectable women rarely entered the Silver Spur, and that the men drinking there were watching her with a mixture of surprise and appreciation. Jacob had turned on his barstool and seen her, and something had happened in his chest that he was not immediately prepared to account for. He had seen plenty of pretty women before. He had danced with them and flirted with them and shared the occasional meal with them at church socials. But there was something about the way Grace Hawkins moved through that saloon, completely unconcerned with what anyone thought of her presence there, absolutely focused on her own purpose, that struck him like a physical thing. Porter had leaned over and murmured, "That's the new schoolteacher, Miss Hawkins. Sharp as a tack, that one. Already got half the parents in town eating out of her hand." Jacob had watched her spot the sheriff's door at the back, change her course toward it without hesitation, and knock twice before entering. He had turned back to his beer and then, without quite deciding to do it, had turned back to watch the door. When she came back out 10 minutes later, the ledger was open in her hands, and she was reading something in it with a small frown of concentration that Jacob found inexplicably charming. He had done something he almost never did, which was act without thinking it through first. He had slid off his barstool and crossed the saloon and positioned himself in her path. "Afternoon, miss," he had said, with the slow, easy smile that had served him perfectly well in exactly this kind of situation many times before. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Jacob Crawford, Rafter C. Ranch. I'd be honored to buy you a drink." Grace Hawkins had looked up from her ledger, taken him in with one quick, clear-eyed assessment, and said, without any particular heat or rudeness but with absolute finality, "No, thank you." And then she had walked around him and out the front door of the Silver Spur, and the entire saloon had gone quiet for a long moment before erupting in the kind of laughter that men produce when they have witnessed something they know they will be talking about for years. Jacob had stood there for a moment, feeling something he could not immediately name because it was so unfamiliar. He had been turned down before, certainly, but never quite like that, never with such complete and unconcerned efficiency, as if he were a minor inconvenience to be navigated rather than a man anyone might want to spend time impressing. He went back to his barstool, and Porter refilled his beer, and the laughter died down, and conversation resumed, and Jacob sat with his drink and thought about a woman with green eyes and a ledger under her arm. He told himself on the ride back to the Rafter Sea that he was simply stung by the novelty of being refused. He told himself it was nothing more than the natural curiosity of a man who was not accustomed to being disregarded. He told himself very firmly that he would think no more about it. He thought about it all the way home, through supper, and for a considerable portion of the night. The following Saturday, he found himself in town again. This was not unusual, as he came to town most Saturdays. What was unusual was that he spent a portion of the afternoon walking past the schoolhouse, which was locked and empty on a Saturday, and standing at the far end of the main street for no apparent reason that he could explain to himself or anyone else. What he was doing, though he refused to use this word, was hoping to see her. He did not see her that Saturday, nor the one after that. On the third Saturday, he was standing outside the general store loading supplies into the back of the ranch wagon when she came out of the store with a basket over one arm, and their eyes met, and Grace Hawkins gave him a brief, polite nod of recognition and kept walking. He caught up to her in 3 strides. "Miss Hawkins," he said, and she stopped and turned, waiting with patient courtesy for him to say something worth listening to. He had a sudden terrifying blankness of mind. "I wanted to apologize," he heard himself say, "for the other week in the saloon. I was forward and you were busy and I wasn't thinking." Something shifted in her expression, a small softening, though her composure remained intact. "There is nothing to apologize for, Mr. Crawford," she said. "You were perfectly polite. I simply had somewhere to be." "Right," he said. "Of course." There was a pause. She waited. "Would you perhaps like to take a walk sometime?" he asked. "When you don't have somewhere to be." She studied him for a moment with those clear green eyes, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being read very accurately. "I will think about it," she said, which was not a yes but was also, importantly, not a no, and she walked away down the street, and Jacob Crawford stood on the boardwalk of Rattlesnake Bend, Texas, and felt something he was only beginning to recognize as the first real stirrings of his entire life changing. He told his closest friend, a fellow ranch hand named Emmett Greer, about Grace Hawkins that evening. Emmett was a 27-year-old Texan with a sunburned nose and a philosophical turn of mind that he disguised behind an easy drawl, and he listened to Jacob's account with the particular attention of a man who is trying not to smile. "So she said no," Emmett said. "She said she'd think about it," Jacob corrected, "after she said no the first time." "That is correct." Emmett leaned back against the fence post they were both resting against, looking out at the darkening plain. "And you haven't been able to stop thinking about her." "I'm curious about her," Jacob said. "That's all." "Right," Emmett said. "That's all." Jacob picked up his hat from the post beside him and put it back on his head. "I'm going to go check on the horses." "Sure," Emmett said pleasantly. "You do that." Jacob went and checked the horses with considerable thoroughness and thought about Grace Hawkins the entire time. The following week, he made a point of attending the town meeting that was held on Thursday evenings in the church, a meeting he had previously avoided as the sort of civic affair that had nothing to do with him. The meeting was about the proposed expansion of the schoolhouse, which the growing population of Rattlesnake Bend's children had made necessary, and Grace Hawkins was there to make the case for the expansion to the town council. Jacob sat in the back row with his hat in his hands. He had not anticipated what it would be like to watch her work. She stood before the council of 6 men, all of whom were older than her and none of whom, Jacob suspected, had expected to be impressed, and she presented her case with the kind of organized, passionate clarity that made the decision seem obvious before she had finished her second sentence. She had numbers, she had plans, she had a hand-drawn diagram of the proposed addition that she'd sketched herself. When Councilman Hatchett, a portly man with a red face who had opinions about everything and knowledge about very little, began to suggest that perhaps the current schoolhouse was sufficient for the town's needs, she waited for him to finish, and then calmly, precisely, and without any trace of personal animosity, demolished every point he had made using nothing but facts and quiet, unshakable logic. The council approved the expansion by 5 votes to 1. Even Hatchet, with bad grace, had eventually nodded his agreement. Jacob walked home from that meeting with the feeling of a man who has just witnessed something that has rearranged his internal furniture without asking permission, and he stood outside the Rafter C bunkhouse in the warm Texas night for a long time before going in, looking up at the stars and thinking about what it meant to be genuinely impressed by someone. The opportunity he had been hoping for came 2 weeks later. The town's annual spring dance was held in the Calloway barn at the edge of the Rafter C's property, a tradition that Tom Calloway maintained partly because he was a man who believed in community and partly because it gave him a reason to have the barn thoroughly cleaned once a year. The whole town turned out, including Grace Hawkins, who came with Mrs. Dunbar, the minister's wife, and who was wearing a dress in a deep green color that Jacob noticed immediately from across the barn. He navigated his way through the crowd with what he hoped was a reasonable approximation of casual purpose, stopping to greet people he knew, accepting a cup of lemonade from the refreshment table, and generally making his way in her direction without being obvious about it. When he finally arrived at her end of the barn, she was talking with Mrs. Dunbar and 2 other women, and she saw him coming and gave him the same brief, composed nod she had given him outside the general store. He waited until there was a natural pause in the conversation and then stepped forward and addressed her directly. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "would you like to dance?" She looked at him steadily. "I would," she said, and something in his chest expanded so rapidly it almost hurt. They danced, and what he discovered was that she danced with the same focused, unself-conscious quality she brought to everything else she did, and she was good at it, light-footed and sure in her movements. He was a decent dancer himself, and they managed the steps of the Virginia reel without either of them embarrassing themselves, and when the music paused between songs, they were standing close enough that he could see the small gold earrings she was wearing and the faint flush of exertion on her cheeks. "You argued well at the council meeting," he said. She looked up at him with something that might have been surprise. "You were there. I was in the back row. I didn't see you," she said. "I was keeping a low profile." "That seems unlike the reputation I've heard about you," she said, with the slightest curve of her mouth that he was learning to watch for. "What reputation would that be?" he asked. "The one where you are the most sociable man in 3 counties, she said. "Emmett talks too much," Jacob said, and she laughed then, genuinely, a low and genuine sound that pleased him enormously. And the fiddle player started up again and they danced a second dance, and then a third. And by the end of the third dance they had been talking continuously and he had learned that she had grown up in Austin, that her father had been a printer and her mother a woman who read everything she could get her hands on, that she had wanted to be a teacher from the age of 8, and that she had left Austin with no regrets except the children she had taught and would not see again. "Do you have family?" he asked, during the walk between dance sets. "A brother in San Antonio," she said. "William, he works for the telegraph company. We write when we can." "I have a mother in Kansas," he said, "and a sister. She's married now outside of Dodge City. I get up to see them when I can, which isn't often enough." She looked at him with what seemed like reassessment. "You have family in Kansas." "I grew up there," he said. "Came to Texas for work when I was 23. Do you plan to stay?" It was a direct question, and he appreciated that about her, the way she asked what she wanted to know without circling around it. "I haven't thought much about it," he said honestly. "I've been content enough at the Rafter C. But I've had thoughts of having my own land someday." "What kind of land?" she asked. "Cattle," he said. "Or maybe horses. I've always had a feeling for horses." They were standing near the open barn door now, and through it the April night was warm and full of stars, and the music was carrying out across the plain. He could see the outline of the mesquite trees against the sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once, a long, wavering note. "I should get back inside," Grace said. "Mrs. Dunbar will wonder." "Of course," he said. And then, because he was learning that with Grace Hawkins the direct approach was not only more honest but also more effective, he said, "May I call on you, Miss Hawkins, properly?" She was quiet for a moment, and in the starlight he could see that she was considering it seriously, not playing at deliberation but actually weighing it. "I would need to know that you are serious," she said. "I don't have patience for things that are only half meant." "Neither do I," he said, and he meant it with a conviction that surprised him a little. She nodded. "Then you may call on Sunday afternoon," she said. "I board with Mrs. Fielding on the north side of the main street." The house with the yellow door. She went back inside, and Jacob stood in the barn doorway for a moment longer, breathing the warm night air, and Emmett materialized from somewhere behind him and clapped him on the shoulder. "Looked like that went tolerably well," Emmett said. "She said I could call on Sunday," Jacob said. "Well then," Emmett said, with the smile he had apparently been holding back for several weeks, "I guess she's thinking about it." Sunday came with the particular quality of light that West Texas reserved for spring mornings, a wide, clean brightness that made everything look new. Jacob put on his good shirt, brushed his jacket, and polished his boots to a shine that Emmett observed with raised eyebrows and a pointed silence. He arrived at Mrs. Fielding's house at 2 in the afternoon, which was the appropriate time for a Sunday call, and he knocked on the yellow door with his hat in his hands. Mrs. Fielding, a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a formidable sense of propriety, answered the door and looked him over with the thoroughness of a woman who has appointed herself the guardian of a young woman's reputation. Whatever she saw apparently satisfied her, because she stepped back and let him in and showed him to the parlor, where Grace was sitting with a book open on her lap, which she set aside when he came in. The parlor was small and warm and smelled of beeswax and dried lavender, and there were lace curtains on the windows and a braided rug on the floor, and it was as far from the bunkhouse and the open range as anything Jacob had been inside in years. He sat in the upright chair Mrs. Fielding indicated, and Grace sat across from him on the settle, and Mrs. Fielding brought them both tea and then retired to the kitchen, where she could almost certainly hear every word they said. They talked for 2 hours. He had not expected it to be easy, given how contained she was, how careful with herself, but she was not guarded the way he had expected. She was direct and thoughtful and honest, and when she asked him a question she listened to the answer with her whole attention, not filling the silence when he paused to find the right word. He found that he wanted to give her the right words, wanted to be accurate with her in a way he had never felt the need to be with anyone before. He told her about his years working cattle drives, the long days and the dust, and the particular satisfaction of bringing a herd through safely after weeks of uncertainty. He told her about the time he had gotten caught in a flash flood crossing the Pecos and had nearly lost everything, and about the old trail boss who had taught him more about patience and quiet authority than anyone else in his life. She told him about her students, and her voice changed when she talked about them, went warmer and more alive, and he listened and understood that this was the center of who she was. "What made you want to teach?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lace curtain moving slightly in the window draft. "My father taught me to read," she said, "before I was 5. He had this old collection of books, poetry and history and natural science, and he would sit with me in the evenings and we would read together. I remember thinking it was the most important thing in the world, to be able to open a book and travel somewhere completely different. I wanted to give that to other children." "And you do," he said. She looked at him. "I try. Porter at the Silver Spur says your students are reading things nobody expected them to read," Jacob said. He said the hatchet boy, who couldn't write his own name 8 months ago, read the notice board out loud for the whole street last month. Grace smiled then, fully and without reservation, and Jacob thought that it was one of the finest things he had ever seen. "Billy Hatchet," she said. "Yes. He was the one who convinced me that every child can learn if you only find the right door." He walked home that evening across the flat, golden plain, and the thought that went through his mind was simple and clear, and did not require any particular examination. He wanted more afternoons like that one. He wanted more of her directness and her warmth, and the way she made him want to be exactly as honest as she was. He wanted to be the person she told things to. He called on her the following Sunday, and the one after that, and the one after that. Mrs. Fielding's tea became a familiar ritual. So did the 2-hour conversations that seemed to go by in 20 minutes. He brought her books from Tom Calloway's library, which was extensive for a ranch, and she received them with genuine pleasure and later told him exactly what she had thought of each one, which was either more or considerably less flattering to the author than Jacob expected. He began to understand that one of the things he loved most about her was the way she engaged with ideas, turning them over and examining them from different angles, willing to be changed by what she found. They began taking walks on Sunday afternoons as well, when the weather permitted, out along the creek that ran behind the main street, where the cottonwood trees made a shifting canopy of green and silver. She wore a different pair of boots for walking than she wore to church, practical brown leather ones, and she did not mind getting the hem of her dress dusty, and she had opinions about the birds along the creek that she had clearly researched and formed on her own. He taught her the names of several plants he had learned from an old Mexican vaquero in New Mexico, and she wrote them down in a small notebook she kept in her pocket, and he was charmed by this attention to learning that extended to everything in her world. It was on one of these walks in early June that he first kissed her. They had been standing on the wooden footbridge over the creek, watching the light change on the water, and she had turned to say something and he had turned at the same moment, and for a second they were very close, and he had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and the question in his eyes must have been clear because she held still rather than stepping back, and he kissed her gently, briefly, and then straightened and waited. "That was not something I was expecting today," she said, very quietly. "Was it unwelcome?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment that lasted approximately one geological era in Jacob's subjective experience. "No," she said, and her cheeks were flushed, and she looked at the water and then back at him. "No, it was not unwelcome." He breathed again. They walked back to Mrs. Fielding's with their hands not quite touching and not quite not touching, and at the yellow door she gave him a look that made his heart do something undignified, and he walked home across the plain in the early summer evening with the feeling of a man who has accidentally stumbled into the most important country of his life. The summer deepened, and so did everything between them. He began meeting her after school on some afternoons, walking her back to Mrs. Fielding's from the schoolhouse, carrying her books when she let him, which was not always but often enough. He brought flowers from the ranch sometimes, wild ones that grew along the fence lines, the red and orange Indian paintbrush that she particularly liked. She began to introduce him to her students when he arrived, and he would sit in the back of the schoolroom sometimes and listen to her teach, and it was the same as that council meeting, the same quality of absolute competence applied with genuine love, and it did things to his chest that he no longer tried to analyze. He told her one afternoon, sitting on the bench outside the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, that he had spoken to Tom Calloway about a plot of land on the eastern edge of the Rafter Seas property. Tom, who was getting on in years and who had been observing Jacob's situation with the particular attention of an older man who has already made all his own mistakes and has views about other people's, had told him that if he wanted to buy that piece of land over time, they could work something out. It was good land, Jacob said. There was water and shade and enough grass for a horse operation. Grace listened to this without interrupting, and when he was done she asked, "Is this something you have decided to do?" "I'm thinking about it seriously," he said. "I think you should do it," she said. "I think you have been working towards something of your own for a long time without quite letting yourself believe it was possible." He looked at her. "You've noticed that?" "I have," she said simply. "You notice a great deal," he said. "I pay attention to things that matter to me," she said, and the simplicity of that statement and the implication it carried stayed with him for days. It was also in that same conversation that she told him something she had not told him before, that the school board in Austin had let her go not only because of her teaching methods, but because she had formally protested in writing the systematic exclusion of the town's Mexican children from the public school. The board had considered this a step too far. She had disagreed and had said so plainly. Jacob sat with this for a moment. "That cost you your position," he said. "Yes," she said. "And would you do it again?" She looked at him with those clear green eyes. "Without hesitation," she said. He nodded. "I thought so," he said quietly, and the admiration in his voice was not something he tried to conceal. He asked Tom Calloway about the land the following Monday morning, and Tom, who had the slightly smug air of a man whose prediction was coming true, agreed to a fair arrangement that would allow Jacob to pay for the land over 4 years. Jacob shook Tom's hand and went to work with the feeling that something new had started, something he had been building toward without knowing quite what shape it would take. He worked the land on weekends, clearing a site for a house, planning the construction of a barn, working out where the water would come from. Emmett helped when he could, and 2 other ranch hands who liked Jacob well enough to donate their Sundays to someone else's dream. The construction of the house began in July, a small but solid structure of local stone and timber, 1 story with a wide porch that faced east toward the creek, and Jacob built it with the same focused care he gave to everything he considered worth doing. Grace came to see it one Sunday afternoon in August, when the frame was up and the roof was beginning to take shape. She stood in the open doorway, the stone walls rising around her, and looked out through the framed window space at the creek and the cottonwoods. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "It's wonderful, Jacob." He had been calling her Grace for 2 months by then, and she had been calling him Jacob, and the simplicity of their names in each other's mouths had come to carry more warmth than a great deal of more elaborate speech. "I thought the kitchen should be here," he said, indicating the eastern wall. "Good morning light." She looked at him with an expression that was careful and open at the same time. "Are you building this house for yourself?" she asked. He met her gaze. "I'm building it with the hope that it won't only be for me," he said. "If that's too forward, I will walk it back." She shook her head slightly. "It is not too forward," she said. "It is direct. I appreciate direct." "I know you do," he said. There was a pause, and the summer air came through the open spaces in the walls, warm and carrying the smell of cedar and dry grass. "I don't know if I am ready to be asked anything yet," she said carefully. "I need you to know that it has nothing to do with my regard for you, which is considerable. It has to do with the fact that I have worked hard for my independence and my position here, and I won't move quickly on something that cannot be undone." "I am not asking anything yet," Jacob said. "I am only telling you the truth about my intentions, so that you know." She nodded, and there was something in the line of her shoulders that had relaxed slightly. "Then I will tell you the truth about mine," she said. "My intentions are serious. I want you to know that too." He smiled, and she smiled back, and they stood in the shell of a house being built with considerable care and hope, and the August sun poured in through the unfinished windows and made the stone walls golden. The trouble, when it came, arrived in September in the form of a man named Dalton Webb. Webb was a land speculator from San Antonio, the kind of man the changing West was producing in increasing numbers, who saw in the drought and economic difficulties of small ranchers an opportunity to accumulate land cheaply. He had arrived in Rattlesnake Bend with a banker from the county seat and a great deal of smooth confidence, and within a week he had begun making offers to several of the smaller landholders in the area. His methods were not violent, as the methods of such men sometimes were in those years, but they were relentless and not always fully honest, and at least 2 families had signed agreements they did not fully understand. What brought him into direct conflict with Grace was the matter of the school. Webb had identified the schoolhouse lot, which was on land that the town technically leased from a private holder, as part of a larger parcel he wanted to consolidate. He had gone to the town council with a proposal that would have moved the school to a smaller location on the outskirts of town, clearly inconvenient for the greatest number of families, in exchange for what he described as a fair payment to the town's general fund. Grace had appeared at the emergency council meeting that was called to discuss this proposal, and she had not brought her ledger or her quiet, organized arguments. She had brought something fiercer than that, a controlled and burning clarity about what was at stake and who would suffer for it. She spoke about the children who walked a mile each way already and would walk 2 miles in the wrong direction if the school moved. She spoke about the parents who had only recently trusted the institution enough to send their children consistently. She spoke about what it meant to take the center of a community's future and push it to the margins for the sake of one man's profit. She was not shouting. She did not need to. She simply told the truth with such precision and such undeniable force that the council, including Hatchett, voted to decline Webb's proposal by a margin of 6-0. Jacob had been at that meeting too. He had heard her, and he had watched Webb's face during her speech, and he had not liked what he saw there, which was not defeat but calculation. After the meeting, he caught up to Grace on the street and walked beside her toward Mrs. Fielding's, and she was still vibrating with the energy of the fight and its outcome, her cheeks flushed, her stride quick and certain. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was furious," she said. "I know," he said. "Those are not mutually exclusive." She looked at him sideways and then laughed a short, real laugh. "No," she agreed, "I suppose they are not." "I want to tell you something," he said. "Webb is not going to leave this alone. He came here to put together a specific parcel and he needs the pieces he's identified to make it work. He will try again." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. "What does he want with the land beyond the school?" "Water rights," Jacob said. "There's a spring on the eastern side of the parcel that feeds 3 properties in addition to the school lot. If he controls that spring, he controls the water for a significant portion of the east side. It's the same thing they've done in other counties." She stopped walking. "How do you know this?" "Tom Calloway has dealt with men like Webb before," Jacob said. "He recognized the pattern, and he's written to a few people in San Antonio who know Webb's history." She turned to face him fully. "You've been investigating." "Tom has," Jacob said. "I've been helping." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, and then she said, "I need to see what Tom found. Can you arrange that?" "I've already asked him," Jacob said. "He's expecting you for dinner on Thursday." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she said, "You did that before I asked." "I thought you would want to know," he said. "I thought you would want to fight it if there was a way." "You know me very well," she said quietly. "I am paying attention," he said, echoing her own words back to her, and the look that crossed her face then was something he kept with him for a long time. The dinner at Tom Calloway's ranch house was informative. Tom, who had taken to Grace with the directness of a man who respected competence wherever he found it, laid out what he had learned. Webb had a history of acquiring water rights in 3 other counties, using a combination of legal pressure and purchased signatures. In 2 of those counties, he had eventually been forced out when the communities organized, and the key in both cases had been ensuring that the public land documents were properly reviewed and any irregularities brought to a county court's attention. Grace had asked precise and intelligent questions, had taken careful notes, and by the end of the evening she had a plan. She would request a formal review of the school lot's lease documents from the county seat. She would organize a meeting of the affected landholders to make sure they understood exactly what they had and had not signed. And she would write to a lawyer in San Antonio who had worked on one of the earlier Webb cases and whose name Tom's contact had provided. Tom had looked across the dinner table at Jacob with a very slight smile that Jacob chose to ignore on the grounds that it was entirely too knowing. Over the following 3 weeks, Grace pursued the matter with the same relentless and organized energy she brought to her classroom. She wrote the letters, organized the landholders' meeting, reviewed the documents, and identified 2 agreements that Webb's banker had obtained through terminology that a plain reading of the law would not support. The lawyer in San Antonio, A woman named Clara Brandt, who had made something of a specialty of land rights cases, wrote back with both legal analysis and moral encouragement. Jacob helped where he could, riding out to neighboring properties to deliver messages and bring back documents, accompanying Grace to 2 meetings that were held at the church in the evenings, making sure she had safe escort on the nights when Webb's presence in town created an atmosphere that made a woman walking alone feel less comfortable than it should have. Webb himself did nothing explicitly threatening, but there were looks and quiet words that Jacob did not like, and he made sure Grace was never left to navigate those alone if he could help it. She noticed, and she accepted it without making it more or less than what it was, a practical consideration, not a diminishment of her capability. "I appreciate you being there," she told him one evening as he walked her home from the church meeting. "I would have been there anyway," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I appreciate it." The matter came to a head in early October. Webb had made one final attempt, this time through a filing at the county courthouse that attempted to claim a portion of the water rights through a historic agreement that was, Clara Brandt's analysis confirmed, fraudulent. Grace submitted the counter-documentation and the legal analysis, and a county judge who had himself been watching Webb's activities with skepticism ruled in favor of the town. Webb left Rattlesnake Bend 3 days later, and the families who had signed questionable agreements had those agreements reviewed, and in one case voided entirely. The night the judgment came through, the Silver Spur was loud and celebratory in the way that small towns celebrate genuine victories, and Grace was there, not at the bar but at a table with several of the families who had been most affected, and there was a genuine warmth and joy in the room that Jacob had rarely seen in a saloon before. He brought her a glass of lemonade, and she accepted it, and their fingers touched briefly on the glass, and she looked up at him with that full, open smile. "We did that," she said. "You did that," he said. "I carried some papers." "You carried a great deal more than papers," she said, and the look in her eyes was warm and direct and entirely clear, and Jacob thought that this woman knew exactly how to make a man feel that he had been seen completely and found to be all right. He asked her to walk with him the next Sunday, out to the property, which was close enough to finished now that it looked like a home. The roof was done, the porch was built, and he had been working on the interior with the same steady care he'd given everything else. They walked out in the autumn afternoon, the Texas sky vast and blue above them, and the mesquite gold at the edges with the beginning of the season's turning. They stood on the porch together, looking east toward the creek. The cottonwoods were beginning to change color, and there were cattle in the distance, and the late afternoon light turned everything warm and amber. He was aware of her standing beside him with the same quality of presence she had brought to that very first afternoon in the schoolhouse, and the awareness was something he had long since stopped trying to manage or contain. "Grace," he said. She turned to look at him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever your answer is, it will not change what is between us, because what is between us is already what it is, and that's not going away regardless of what you say." She was very still, watching him. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you, I think, since you said no to me in the Silver Spur and walked out the door without a backward glance, and I have been trying to understand it ever since, and I think I finally do. You are the most honest person I have ever known. You love fiercely, and you fight for things that are worth fighting for, and you think more clearly than anyone I have met, and you treat me like someone worth being honest with, and that is the finest thing anyone has ever given me." She had not looked away. Her eyes were bright. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I am asking you, not telling you. And I know you will need to think about it, and I know that your work here is your own, and your life is your own, and it will continue to be, and I am not asking you to give up anything. I am asking you to let me be here, to let me stay." There was a long silence in which the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and somewhere a meadowlark called, and Jacob stood very quietly and let her think. "Jacob," she said at last. "Yes. I love you too," she said. I have been telling myself not to move too fast and not to trust the feeling too quickly and to be reasonable, and all of that is perfectly sensible advice." She paused. "I find I don't particularly want to take it." He let out a breath he had apparently been holding for quite a long time. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes." He took her hands, both of them, and she let him. And they stood there on the porch of the house he had built with enough intention and enough hope that it had turned out to be exactly the right place for this moment. And he did not kiss her immediately, which she later told him she had appreciated, because it gave both of them a moment simply to be inside the fact of it before anything else happened. And then he did kiss her, and she returned it with a warmth and certainty that told him everything he needed to know about how she had been feeling and how carefully she had been containing it. They went back to Mrs. Fielding's in the late afternoon, and Grace told Mrs. Fielding, who had been expecting this news for at least 2 months, and who received it with a misty-eyed satisfaction, she managed to keep mostly dignified. Jacob rode back to the Rafter Sea and told Emmett, who said, "Finally," with such emphasis that the word could probably have been heard in the next county. They were married in December in the Rattlesnake Bend church, in a ceremony of such entirely sincere happiness that even people who were not particularly sentimental found themselves moved. Tom Calloway, who attended in his best suit, blew his nose twice during the vows and maintained afterward that he had a persistent cold. Emmett stood up for Jacob, and Mrs. Dunbar, the minister's wife, stood with Grace. Grace's brother William came from San Antonio, a rail-thin young man with his sister's direct eyes and a warmth and humor that Jacob immediately liked. The children from Grace's school attended, crowding into the back pews and sitting with remarkable restraint, because Grace had told them they might come if they behaved, and they wanted very much to be there. Grace wore a dress of deep cream wool, not a formal white gown but something she had made in the town, simple and beautifully fitted, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that had been pressed and dried from the summer. She walked down the aisle of the church with William at her side, and when she reached Jacob and he looked at her, the composure that was so naturally hers was slightly undone, not gone, but tender at the edges, and she was smiling. The minister said the words, and they said their vows to each other clearly and without looking away, and Jacob put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that he had chosen because she would not have wanted anything fussy, and the minister said they were married, and the children in the back pews cheered loudly enough that several adults in the congregation startled, and Grace laughed, and Jacob laughed too, and they kissed in front of the whole town, and the whole town approved. The celebration afterward was held in the Calloway barn, by tradition and by the natural generosity of Tom Calloway, who provided the food and the musicians and was clearly extremely pleased with how the whole thing had come out. There was dancing, and Grace and Jacob danced together the way they had at the spring dance where everything had begun, except that now it carried the weight of everything that had happened since, and everyone could see it, and everyone understood. Grace told Jacob, during a quiet moment between dances when they had stepped outside the barn door exactly as they had at the spring dance months before, that she had a condition of their marriage she had neglected to state at the ceremony. He looked at her with an expression of gentle alarm. "What condition?" "I intend to keep teaching," she said. "The school needs me and I need it." "Of course you will keep teaching," he said, sounding slightly offended that this required stating. "Did you think I was going to suggest otherwise?" She looked at him carefully. "Most men would." "I am not most men," he said. "No," she agreed with a full smile. "You are decidedly not." "Is there another condition?" he asked. "Only that you tell me the truth always," she said, "even when it is uncomfortable." "Done," he said immediately. "And I will do the same," she said. "I know," he said. "You always have." She took his hand and they went back inside to the warmth and the music and the people who were happy for them, and the night continued, full and golden and entirely right. The first months of their marriage settled into a rhythm that was comfortable and sustaining in the way that good things, rightly built, tend to be. Grace continued teaching, walking to the schoolhouse in the morning and coming home in the afternoon, and Jacob continued working, first finishing the small horse barn on their property and acquiring the first 4 horses, and then gradually, over the following year, building the small operation he had planned. Tom Calloway remained his employer, but the relationship shifted, as Tom had always intended it would, into something more like partnership, with Jacob having enough of his own enterprise that his days at the Rafter Sea were chosen rather than simply required. Their house settled into itself. Grace arranged the kitchen the way she wanted it, and it turned out that she was an excellent cook when she had a kitchen she controlled and recipes she had chosen. And Jacob was a man who ate with genuine and expressed appreciation, which she said was an underrated quality in a husband. He built shelves along the whole of the parlor's east wall for her books, which she had sent for from Austin, and which arrived over several months in packages that she received with the same joy she received nothing else. He would come home sometimes to find her sitting in the good chair by the parlor window, her feet tucked under her, a book open on her knees, and he would make coffee and sit nearby, and they would spend evenings reading in comfortable companionship that he had not known was possible and now could not imagine being without. She took an interest in the horses in a way that surprised him and then should not have surprised him, because of course Grace Hawkins took an interest in anything she was proximate to and had access to. By the summer after their wedding, she could handle the calmer animals confidently, and Jacob began teaching her to ride properly, which turned into a series of Saturday morning lessons out in the east pasture that were simultaneously practical, and, in a way he would not have been able to articulate, one of his favorite recurring experiences of his life. She learned well, applying herself with characteristic thoroughness, and by the end of the summer she rode with a confident independence that made his chest swell in a way that had nothing to do with proprietary pride, and everything to do with the simple pleasure of seeing someone he loved do something well. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Grace told him she was expecting a child. He received this news in the kitchen of their house on a Tuesday evening after supper, and for a moment he simply stood very still, and then he sat down in the chair beside him because his legs felt uncertain, and he said, "Are you certain?" "Doc Prout confirmed it this afternoon," she said, watching him with those clear eyes. "Are you all right?" "I am extremely all right," he said. "I am trying not to make a spectacle of myself." She laughed, and he stood back up and came around the table to her and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held, which Grace did not always, because she was not a person who defaulted to leaning, but when she chose to lean into him it always felt like a significant gift. "Are you happy?" he asked, against the top of her head. "I am," she said, quietly and without qualification. He held her in the kitchen of their stone house in West Texas in the spring of 1883, and felt the full, settled weight of a life that had become exactly what he had not known he was hoping for. The summer that followed was one of those seasons that seemed to slow themselves down in memory, as if accommodating their own importance. Grace continued teaching until July, when the heat and the advancing pregnancy made the daily walk and the long hours impractical, and she spent the last months of her time before the birth preparing with the same organized thoroughness she applied to everything. She wrote lists. She corresponded with Clara Brandt in San Antonio about legal documentation she wanted in order for her return to teaching after the birth. She taught herself to knit with a stubbornness that won out over the initial frustration, and she continued, with Jacob's agreement, to advise the town council on school matters in writing. Jacob fussed over her in ways he tried to make inconspicuous, and which she tolerated with more affection than exasperation. He made sure there was always water on the porch in the evenings, where it was cooler, and he came home at midday when he could, and he learned to cook 3 dishes with some competence so that she did not have to stand at the kitchen stove when the July heat made the kitchen unbearable. She found this both touching and slightly funny, and told him so, and he said that he had no objection to being found funny so long as she ate the food he made, which she did. William came from San Antonio in August, thin and cheerful and clearly glad to be useful, and he stayed for 2 weeks, helping with everything from the washing to the horse barn, and Jacob liked him more each time they were together. Grace and William talked in the evenings with the ease of siblings who had always been genuinely fond of each other, and Jacob would listen to them and feel the specific contentment of watching someone he loved be loved by people who had known her long before he had. The baby came in late September, which the midwife, a practical and experienced woman named Mrs. Castillo, who had delivered most of the children in the county over the past 15 years, declared a fine time of year for arriving, when the worst of the summer heat was past and the nights were beginning to cool. The labor was hard, as first labors tend to be, and it was long, and Jacob spent most of it sitting outside the bedroom door feeling completely helpless and occasionally going out to the porch to look at the stars and talk to God in terms that were more blunt than reverent. The boy was born at 3:30 in the morning, and Mrs. Castillo came to the bedroom door and told Jacob he could come in. And he went in, and Grace was in the bed looking exhausted and luminous in the way that apparently some women manage after an ordeal that would have flattened most people. And she was holding the baby, and when Jacob sat beside her on the bed, she handed the baby to him. The boy was red-faced and small and already looking at the world with an expression of concentrated attention that Jacob recognized immediately. "He looks like you," Jacob said. "He looks like a baby," Grace said. "They all look the same." "He looks like you," Jacob maintained, examining the tiny face with enormous care. Grace smiled at her husband holding their son, and it was the kind of smile she had given him on the porch of their house when she said yes, full and open and without reserve. They named him Henry William Crawford, Henry for Jacob's father, who had died when Jacob was 12, and whose steadiness Jacob had spent his life trying to emulate, and William for Grace's brother, who received the news by telegram and wrote back within 2 days with a letter so full of genuine happiness that it made Grace cry, which she did privately and would have denied if asked. Henry Crawford was a determined and observant child from the beginning, as if having been born to 2 people who paid close attention to the world around them had given him no other option. He was healthy and grew well, and Grace returned to teaching in January, when Henry was 3 months old, and Mrs. Castillo's niece, a capable young woman named Rosa who was 19 and gentle and reliable, came to the house during the school hours to look after him. Grace nursed him morning and evening, and through the middle of the day on Saturdays and Sundays, and the arrangement worked with a practicality that Grace had planned and that Jacob respected and supported without qualification. The years moved with the particular quality of years that are full, quickly in experience, slowly in memory. Jacob's horse operation grew into something he was genuinely proud of, not large by the standards of the great ranches but solid and well-regarded, and the horses he bred and trained were known in the county for their quality and soundness. Emmett Greer, who had left the Rafter C 2 years after Jacob did, and started a modest cattle operation of his own further south, came to visit several times a year, and was reliably good company and unerringly accurate in his quiet observations about everything he saw. Tom Calloway died in the winter of 1885, peacefully, in the armchair by his fireplace, and left the Rafter C to his nephew in Kansas, who came briefly, and then sold the operation to a cattle company that ran it differently and less personally. Jacob attended Tom's funeral with the genuine grief of someone who had lost a mentor and a friend, and Grace sat beside him through the service with her hand in his, and the small kindness of that hand anchored him through the whole afternoon. Henry grew into a bright and curious boy who followed his father around the horse barn asking questions that were frequently difficult to answer, and his mother around the house and schoolroom with the same attention. At 4, he could recognize 15 different horse breeds by sight. At 5, he came home from his first full day at school, in Grace's classroom, and declared that reading was the most important thing in the world, which made Grace set her sewing down and look at the ceiling for a moment with an expression Jacob could not quite interpret except that it was clearly something significant and private. In the spring of 1886, their daughter arrived, smaller than Henry had been and considerably more immediately vocal about it. They named her Clara Rose, Clara for the lawyer in San Antonio who had helped them fight Dalton Webb and who had remained a correspondent and friend of Grace's in the years since, and Rose because Grace had grown a small rose bush on the south side of the house, and it was the thing in the garden that she loved most purely, and for no practical reason at all. Clara was different from her brother in every way, which seemed appropriate, since Grace and Jacob had agreed between themselves early on that they had no particular wish to produce the same child twice. Clara was headlong and loud and joyful, with Jacob's brown eyes and a personality that seemed to be conducting all of its business at twice the normal speed. Henry adored her with the somewhat beleaguered patience of an older sibling who has not necessarily signed up for this, but who knows his duty. Clara worshipped Henry with a completeness and a totality of feeling that he would spend the next several decades trying to live up to. Grace taught until the Friday before Clara was born and was back in her classroom 6 weeks later, and the children of Rattlesnake Bend grew up over those years understanding, without it ever being formally stated, that their teacher was the kind of woman who demonstrated by example that a person could be many things at once and do all of them with intention and love. There was trouble in 1887 with a drought that hit hard across West Texas, and Jacob's horse operation struggled through 2 lean years as the grass dried and the water in the creek dropped to a trickle, and families across the county made difficult calculations. Jacob and Grace spent more than one evening at the kitchen table going over the accounts with the shared honesty they had promised each other at the beginning. And while it was frightening in the way that genuine economic uncertainty is frightening, what Jacob found was that facing it together with someone he trusted completely was entirely different from facing it alone, and the fear never became despair. The drought broke in the summer of 1889, dramatically and with considerable relief, and the recovery took another year, but it came. The horse operation stabilized and then grew again, and by 1890 Jacob had hired 2 young men to help with the work and was training horses for buyers from as far away as Abilene. Henry was 7 by then, and Clara was 4, and the house on the creek felt both full and right, the kind of rightness that comes from things being genuinely what they appear to be rather than simply arranged to look that way. Emmett married a woman named Dolores Vega in 1888, a spirited and warm-hearted woman from a ranching family south of town who had known him for 3 years before she agreed to it, which Emmett said was fair given how long it had taken him to work up to asking properly. Grace and Dolores became genuine friends, the sort of friends who talked directly to each other about real things, and Jacob was glad of this because Grace's social world was largely built from professional relationships and family, and she deserved someone who would argue with her about books on a regular basis, which Dolores did. The schoolhouse was expanded again in 1890, this time to a proper 2-room building, and a second teacher was hired to take the upper grades, which freed Grace to focus on the younger children, which was where she had always felt her particular gift lay anyway. She attended the County Education Conference in Abilene that fall, the first woman to represent a Rattlesnake Bend school, and came back with 3 new teaching methods, 2 new books, and an expression that suggested she had spent several days in a state of energized productive argument, which Jacob recognized as her version of a perfect holiday. Jacob sometimes thought, in the evenings after the children were in bed and Grace was reading, and the fire was low, and the Texas night was quiet outside, about the sequence of events that had brought him to this specific chair in this specific house. He thought about the afternoon he had slid off a bar stool in the Silver Spur and positioned himself in the path of a woman who was going somewhere and had no interest in being delayed. He thought about the moment she had looked at him, assessed him, and dismissed him with 2 words and a complete absence of self-consciousness. He thought about the feeling he had had, standing in that saloon while the other men laughed, which had not been humiliation but something closer to recognition, as if something in him had understood immediately that this was a person who would not lie to him, not even in the small social ways that people lie to each other constantly, and that this was the rarest thing he had ever encountered. He had loved her at that moment. He was fairly sure, though he had not known it yet. The understanding had come gradually, in the weeks of watching and wanting, and the growing certainty that what drew him to her was not simply her face or her manner, but who she essentially and irreducibly was. She was honest and she was brave and she cared about things that mattered and she worked for them with her whole self. And she had let him in when he had demonstrated that he was worth letting in, and she had trusted him with the truth of herself, and he had done the same. And what they had built from that was solid in the way that things built on true foundations are solid. He looked across the room at her in the lamplight, a woman at 35 who was more herself and more fully known to him, and more beautiful to him than the 26-year-old with the ledger under her arm had been. And the love he felt was not the startled, urgent thing of those early weeks, but something deeper and more fully settled. A river rather than a rainstorm, wide and reliable and clear. She looked up from her book, sensing his attention, and raised an eyebrow in the slightly amused way she had when she caught him watching her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The Silver Spur Saloon," he said. "That is not what I expected," she said. "Why?" "I was thinking about the afternoon you walked through there like you owned it," he said, "and told me no." She set her book down on her knee, her finger marking the place. "I told you no because I had somewhere to be." "I know," he said. "That was entirely the point." She looked at him with those clear green eyes, and after a moment the slight smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Jacob Crawford," she said. "Grace Crawford," he said. "You are a very strange man," she said. "I have been told that," he said. "I consider it one of your finer qualities," she said, and picked up her book, and he smiled and looked back at the fire, and the house was warm and quiet around them, full of the breathing presence of children sleeping and the low sound of the wind along the creek outside, and it was, Jacob thought, exactly what life was supposed to be. The following decades settled around them the way good decades do, not without difficulty or change, but with a fundamental stability that allowed growth rather than simply survival. Henry grew into a lanky, quiet, observant young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision of thought, and who took to horses with a natural gift that made Jacob proud in a way he sometimes had to contain, because the boy found excessive praise embarrassing. By the time Henry was 12, he was riding as well as any of Jacob's hired men, and by 14, he was helping break the young horses in a careful and methodical way that had the instinct of something born rather than only learned. Clara was both the simpler and more complicated child. She had her father's social ease and her mother's direct intelligence, and she combined them in a way that made her universally liked and occasionally exhausting. She read everything Grace gave her and then went looking for more, and she asked questions about the world beyond Rattlesnake Bend with a frequency and urgency that told both her parents early that the town would not hold her permanently. This was not a grief, merely a fact, and they prepared her for it with the same clear-eyed honesty they brought to everything. Grace's work evolved with the school over those years. She guided the younger children through their first reading with the same patient joy she had brought to it from the beginning, and she watched the children of Rattlesnake Bend grow into young people who could think and question and imagine a larger world. And this was the work that fed her the way the land and the horses fed Jacob, and she never stopped being grateful for it. The town itself grew through the 1890s, drawn by the railroad line that came through in 1892, and changed the economy and the character of Rattlesnake Bend in ways both welcome and complicated. New families arrived, and new businesses, and the population doubled in 5 years, and the Silver Spur was joined by 2 other saloons and eventually a proper hotel. The changes brought new children to Grace's classroom and new buyers to Jacob's horse operation, and they navigated them together with the same practical partnership they had always relied on. In 1895, on a clear October afternoon, Jacob saddled 2 horses and they rode out together along the creek while Henry managed the barn and Rosa, who had long since become a full member of their household world, stayed with Clara. They rode east past the cottonwoods and up onto a low ridge from which you could see a long way in every direction, the flat shine of the land under the autumn sun, the distant smudge of the town to the west, and the wide sky above everything. They stopped at the top of the ridge and sat their horses side by side, looking out at the distance, and Jacob said, "Do you ever miss Austin?" Grace considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. "I miss my students there sometimes," she said. "I wonder how they turned out." She paused. "But no, I don't miss it as a place. This is my place." He nodded. "And are you happy, truly?" She turned to look at him with an expression that was both serious and entirely warm. "You ask me that," she said, "as if the answer has ever been in doubt." "I ask because I want to hear you say it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and the October light was golden on her face and her auburn hair, more generously threaded with silver now than it had been on that spring afternoon when she walked through the Silver Spur without glancing in his direction. "I am deeply, completely happy," she said. "I have work that matters to me. I have children who are remarkable people, which is partly luck and partly their own doing. And I have you, Jacob Crawford, who is the best person I know, and who has never once made me smaller than I am." He sat with this for a moment, letting it settle in him. "That's a high standard," he said. "You have always met it," she said simply. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, and she held his, and they sat on the ridge in the October afternoon and looked at the wide country they had both chosen and which had, in the way of chosen things, become entirely their own. They rode home in the late afternoon, along the creek and through the cottonwoods, past the horse barn where they could hear Henry singing to the horses as he worked, which was a habit the boy had developed early and showed no sign of giving up, and through the yard where the rose bush on the south wall had put out a final brave bloom for the season, and into the house where Clara had apparently decided to help Rosa with supper, and had achieved a level of flower distribution that extended to the ceiling, and which Grace surveyed with an expression that started as exasperation and ended as laughter, and Jacob laughed too, and Clara was undeterred, and the supper was eventually accomplished. And they all ate together at the table in the kitchen, with the evening light coming in through the east window, and the good smell of the food, and the sound of the family talking. After supper Henry went out to do the last check on the horses, as he did every evening, and Jacob went with him, as he did more and more often, not because the boy needed supervision, but because it was good to walk beside him in the quiet dark of the barn, and listen to him talk about the horses with an informed love that Jacob recognized as his own, given back to him in a form he had not anticipated. They talked about a young mare who was ready to start serious training, and about a buyer coming from Abilene the following week, and about whether there was sense in acquiring a new stallion from a line they'd heard good things about. And the conversation was practical and companionable, and it made Jacob think of Tom Calloway, whom he still missed, and of the old trail boss in Kansas, and of all the people who had passed knowledge forward to him, and who were honored now in the passing forward of it. Clara was asleep when they came back in, having used up a complete day's energy in the flower incident and the subsequent supper. Henry went to bed shortly after. Jacob found Grace in the parlor, sitting in her chair with a new book, but she had put it down on her knee and was looking at the fire rather than reading, which meant she was thinking about something. He sat in his chair across from her. "What is it?" She looked at him. "Nothing bad," she said. I was thinking that the Hendersons' youngest, Maria, who is 6 and has been having trouble with reading, suddenly got it today. She just suddenly had it. She read a whole sentence clearly, and she looked at me with such surprise, as if she hadn't known her own capacity. He nodded. I was thinking that it never gets ordinary, she said. That moment. I have seen it hundreds of times, and it never becomes ordinary. Of course it doesn't, he said, because it's real every time. She looked at him for a long moment. That is exactly right, she said, with a quiet certainty, and picked up her book. And he picked up the newspaper that had arrived that day and was 3 days old by the time of its arrival, which was the nature of newspapers in West Texas in 1895 and entirely normal. And the fire crackled low, and the house settled around them. And outside, the Texas stars were out in their full, uncontested brightness over the flat and ancient land. It was a life built from true materials, honestly joined, and it held. It held through the years and through the changes, and through the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties that every life contains. And it held because its foundation was two people who had chosen each other with their eyes open, and had gone on choosing each other, day by day and year by year, with the particular fidelity of those who understand that love is not something that happens to you once and remains regardless of what you do with it, but something you build, as you build anything worth having, with patience and intention and care, and with the willingness to tell the truth when the truth is difficult, and to stay. Henry Crawford was 18 years old and had already demonstrated the makings of a fine horseman and a thoughtful young man when he told his parents he wanted to study agriculture at the new Texas College in College Station, and his father drove him to the stage in Rattlesnake Bend on a September morning in 1901, with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything he considered worth doing, and his mother kissed him on the forehead and pressed a book of poetry into his hands, which he accepted with the embarrassed gratitude of a young man who knows the book is good even if he is not going to say so in front of the other passengers. Clara, who was 15 and very certain about the world in the way of 15-year-olds, declared that she was going to be a lawyer, and said so to anyone who would listen, and wrote a letter to Clara Brandt in San Antonio, after whom she had been named, asking for advice on how to proceed, and received a letter back that was so full of specific, practical, encouraging information that Clara read it 3 times, and then kept it folded in the front of her school notebook. Grace read this letter over Clara's shoulder, and then went to the kitchen and cried briefly into the dishwater, not from sadness, but from the feeling of seeing something come full circle. Jacob watched all of it with the same steady attention he had brought to his horses and his land and his marriage, and the feeling it produced in him was not the distant, aching pride that some fathers described, but something warmer and more present, the simple pleasure of people he loved becoming more fully themselves. The years continued, as years do, each one building on the last, the way a house builds on its foundation, story by stone. Rattlesnake Bend grew and changed around them, as Texas itself grew and changed, the old open range world of Jacob's early cowboy years, giving way to the fenced and organized and increasingly complicated landscape of the new century. Some of the changes were good and some were losses, and most were both at once, and Jacob and Grace talked about all of it at the kitchen table and on the porch in the evenings, and on their occasional rides along the creek, where the cottonwoods had grown tall and broad over the years and made a cathedral of shade and silver light that was one of the most beautiful places Jacob knew. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, in December of 1901, Jacob took Grace back to the porch of their house in the cold, clear night, and they stood together looking east at the creek and the cottonwoods and the stars above the plain, and it was the same view they had stood looking at on the afternoon he had asked her, except that it was winter now and the trees were bare and the sky was very dark and the stars were extraordinary. 20 years, he said. 20 years, she agreed. I would like to make a statement, he said. She looked at him with a slight smile. You have my full attention. "I have been the happiest man in West Texas for 20 years," he said, "and the reasons for it are standing right here." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was very soft. "Jacob." "I know," he said. "You don't need to say it." "I know I don't," she said, "but I want to. You were the first man who ever saw me whole and did not try to make me smaller. And I have loved you for every day of 20 years, and for every day before that since the moment I understood that was what I was doing." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of their house in the cold December night, and the stars were out in all their wild profusion above the flat West Texas plain, and somewhere along the creek an owl called once, clear and low, and the land was quiet around them, full and right and entirely their own, and there was nothing unresolved, nothing incomplete, nothing left undone that should have been done, only the good, full, honest weight of a life built together and still, with grace and intention and love, continuing to build.